The chandeliers of Ashford House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and champagne glasses held by the assembled nobility of London, but the brilliance only served to sharpen the shadows gathering in the corners of the grand ballroom, where autumn rain lashed against the tall windows like accusatory fingers. Catherine Ashford stood in the center of that glittering assembly, her spine straight as a birch tree, her hands folded before her with a composure that cost her more than anyone watching could ever know, while her husband, Lord Edmund Ashford, Viscount of considerable fortune and even greater vanity, stood 3 paces away from her, as though proximity to her might contaminate him with whatever inadequacy he was about to proclaim. The whispers had already begun, rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat, for it was unprecedented to summon society to witness a private matter, and everyone present sensed the approach of spectacle, that particular variety of entertainment that the nobility consumed with barely concealed relish when it concerned the misfortunes of others. Edmund's voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the room with practiced ease, for he had always possessed an actor's talent for performance. "My lords, my ladies, I have called you here tonight as witnesses to a most regrettable necessity," he began, his handsome face arranged in an expression of noble suffering that Catherine recognized as entirely false, for she had lived with this man for 5 years and knew every shade of his duplicity. "It pains me deeply, but I must declare before you all that my marriage to Lady Catherine must be dissolved. Despite every effort, every consultation with the finest physicians in England, she has proven unable to provide me with an heir. A man of my position cannot allow his lineage to die, his estates to pass to distant cousins, his name to fade into obscurity for want of children. Therefore, I am formally severing our union on the grounds of barrenness." The word hung in the air like a curse, and Catherine felt it strike her chest with physical force, though her expression did not change, for she had known this was coming, not tonight perhaps, not this public humiliation, but she had felt Edmund's coldness, growing for months, had seen the calculation in his eyes whenever he looked at her increasingly rare visits to her chambers. The ballroom erupted in a storm of whispers, fans fluttering like butterfly wings as the ladies leaned toward one another to share their shock, their pity, their secret satisfaction that tragedy had struck someone else's household rather than their own. Catherine's eyes swept across the sea of faces, some genuinely sympathetic, most merely curious, a few openly contemptuous, and she understood in that moment that she was no longer Viscountess Ashford, no longer a respected member of society, but had been transformed by her husband's words into an object of pity and speculation, a cautionary tale mothers would whisper to daughters about the fundamental duty of wives. She saw Lady Pemberton's hand flutter to her own swollen belly in a gesture of unconscious protection, saw Lord Hartwick shake his head with something that might have been genuine regret, saw Edmund's younger brother Thomas look away in what she hoped was shame at this cruelty. Edmund continued speaking, something about arrangements and settlements, about Catherine being provided for according to her station despite her failure, and she heard her own inadequacy being catalogued in legal terms, reduced to matters of property and pounds, but she had stopped listening because she had already made her decision. She would not remain here to be dissected by these people, would not accept Edmund's charity or perform the role of grateful, apologetic failure that he clearly expected of her. When he finally finished his speech, and the crowd began to close in with their terrible sympathy and veiled curiosity, Catherine turned without a word and walked through them as though they were merely shadows, her head high, her step measured, walking through the doors of Ashford House and knowing she would never return. By midnight, as rain continued to fall and the servants whispered in corners about the scandal, Catherine had packed a single small trunk with the belongings she had brought to this marriage 5 years ago, for she would take nothing that bore Edmund's mark, and departed for her late mother's cottage in Derbyshire, leaving behind the title, the jewels, the illusion of belonging, and carrying with her only the tattered remnants of her dignity and a grief so vast it felt like drowning. The cottage appeared through morning mist like a memory half forgotten, its stone walls covered in ivy that had grown wild in the years since Catherine's mother had passed, the garden that had once been her pride now surrendered to brambles and autumn's decay, and Catherine stood before it with her small trunk at her feet, feeling as though she had travelled not merely the 2 days' journey from London, but had somehow crossed backward through time to a version of herself that had existed before ambition, and society had reshaped her into Lady Ashford. The key still hung on its chain around her neck. She had kept it all these years despite Edmund's subtle suggestions that she sell the property, his discomfort with her maintaining any asset independent of his control, and when she turned it in the lock, the door opened with a groan of rusted hinges onto rooms thick with dust and the particular silence of long abandonment. She spent that first day in a fury of activity, throwing open windows despite the cold, sweeping floors, beating carpets, scrubbing surfaces, as though she could clean away not merely the physical evidence of neglect, but also the humiliation that clung to her skin like ash. And by nightfall she collapsed into her mother's old bed, her hands raw and her body exhausted, and wept with a violence she had not permitted herself in London, great tearing sobs that shook her entire frame until she had nothing left inside her but emptiness. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of solitude and grief, for Catherine had sent no word to anyone of her location and received no visitors in return, and she moved through the cottage like a ghost haunting her own past, finding her mother's books still on the shelves, her sewing basket still beside the chair by the window, the garden tools still hanging in the small shed where her mother had spent so many happy hours cultivating beauty from earth. Catherine's internal voice, which had been so carefully controlled during her marriage, now ran in ceaseless circles of recrimination and analysis. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of monthly disappointments, 5 years of physicians who examined her with cold hands and colder pronouncements, 5 years of Edmund's increasing distance and barely concealed contempt, 5 years of her own desperate prayers and hopeless remedies, 5 years of her fundamental failure as a woman, as a wife, as a continuation of her family's bloodline that would now end with her because her body had betrayed every purpose for which she had been raised. Weeks passed in this manner, autumn deepening into the first threats of winter, and Catherine ventured no further than her garden, where she half-heartedly attempted to reclaim some small portion from the wilderness, though she often found herself simply sitting on the stone bench her father had built, staring at nothing, time sliding past, unmarked and unmourned. It was during the 4th week of her exile that she first noticed the peculiar fatigue that seemed to settle into her bones like lead, a weariness that no amount of rest could remedy, and the morning nausea that drove her from bed to retch into the chamber pot with such violence that she had to grip the bedpost to remain upright. But she attributed these symptoms to grief, to the physical manifestation of heartbreak, to her body finally surrendering to the sorrows her mind had been cataloguing so meticulously, and she thought nothing more of it, never imagining that her failure to conceive in 5 years of marriage might have finally, impossibly, ended in the very weeks before Edmund had cast her aside. The Duke of Rothermere arrived on a morning when frost had begun to silver the edges of Catherine's unkempt garden, his carriage bearing the Blackwood crest, a raven clutching a branch of oak, announcing his status before he had even descended from within. And Catherine, who had been attempting to pull weeds from the flower bed with hands that shook from weakness, looked up to see a figure of such commanding presence that she instinctively stepped backward, her boots catching on brambles. Adrian Blackwood was tall, broad-shouldered, his hair dark as coal, and his eyes an unsettling shade of grey that seemed to perceive far more than Catherine wished to reveal, and she knew him by reputation, though they had never been formally introduced during her years in London. The Duke of Rothermere, possessor of vast estates and even vaster wealth, a man who moved through society with the confidence of someone who had never needed its approval, and who had, she recalled now with a chill of recognition, once been Edmund's closest friend, before some unnamed rupture had transformed them into enemies who refused even to acknowledge one another at public gatherings. He approached with measured steps, his greatcoat perfectly tailored, his boots glossed despite the muddy lane, and when he removed his hat and bowed with impeccable formality, Catherine became suddenly painfully aware of her own appearance, her dress stained with dirt, her hair escaping its pins, her face surely showing the toll of weeks spent in grief and isolation. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice low and carrying an accent that spoke of education and authority, "I apologize for calling without prior notice. I am Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Rothermere. I have recently purchased Blackwood Manor, the estate bordering your property, and thought it proper to introduce myself to my neighbour." Catherine forced herself to curtsy despite the dizziness that threatened to topple her, gripping her garden trowel as though it might anchor her to steadiness. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears after weeks of disuse. "You find me at a disadvantage. I am not prepared to receive visitors." His eyes, those penetrating grey eyes, swept over her face with an intensity that made her want to retreat into the cottage, and she saw something shift in his expression, some calculation or concern she could not name. "I require no ceremony, Lady Catherine. I merely wish to make your acquaintance and to assure you that my presence here will not disturb your peace. I understand you have sought solitude." There was no pity in his tone, no reference to the scandal that must surely have reached even his elevated ears. But Catherine detected something else: knowledge, perhaps, or a careful respect that felt more unsettling than sympathy would have been. She drew herself up, summoning the dignity that had carried her through the ballroom at Ashford House. "That is kind of you, Your Grace. I trust we shall be cordial neighbours, though I am not inclined toward society at present." He studied her for a moment longer, and Catherine had the distinct impression that he was cataloguing details she could not conceal: the pallor of her skin, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way she held herself as though movement required conscious effort. And when he finally nodded and replaced his hat, she felt both relief and a strange disappointment. "Should you require anything, Lady Catherine, you need only send word to the manor. I am at your service." He bowed again and departed, his carriage rolling away down the overgrown lane. But Catherine stood in her garden long after he had disappeared, her heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm, sensing that something in her carefully maintained isolation had been irrevocably disturbed by those grey eyes and that measured voice, though she could not yet name what had shifted in the air between them. The first delivery arrived 3 days after the Duke's visit, a cart laden with split firewood, neatly stacked and carried to Catherine's woodshed by 2 young men who touched their caps respectfully and departed before she could formulate a protest. And when she discovered the unsigned note tucked beneath the top log, written in a bold masculine hand, it read simply, "Winter approaches. You will need this." And Catherine stood in her doorway with the paper trembling in her fingers, pride warring with the practical acknowledgement that her own meagre supply would never have lasted through the cold months ahead. She composed a polite refusal that very afternoon, sealing it with wax that had belonged to her mother, and sent it via the village boy to Blackwood Manor. But the next morning brought another delivery, a basket of provisions containing flour, butter, preserves, tea of a quality she had not tasted since leaving London, and fresh bread still warm from the ovens. And this time the note read, "No obligation, only neighbourly concern. R." The initials stood stark and uncompromising at the bottom of the page, and Catherine felt something crack in the armour she had constructed around her grief, something dangerous and unwelcome that felt perilously close to gratitude. For a week she wavered between accepting and refusing, her practical needs growing more urgent as November's chill deepened, and her inexplicable fatigue made even simple tasks feel monumental. And when a third delivery arrived, this time a wooden crate containing books, their leather bindings rich and their titles ranging from poetry to philosophy to novels she had longed to read, but Edmund had deemed unsuitable for a woman of her position. Catherine finally understood that the Duke would not be dissuaded by her protests, that his kindness, whatever motivated it, would continue regardless of her response. She found herself examining each volume with hands that shook slightly, running her fingers over gilt lettering, opening pages to find marginalia in that same bold script, and in the margins of a volume of Wordsworth someone, the Duke himself, she realized had written observations that revealed a mind of considerable depth and unexpected sensitivity, and she caught herself wondering what manner of man would notice a neighbour's isolation and respond not with pity but with provisions and poetry. The curiosity that bloomed in her chest felt like betrayal somehow, as though by wondering about Adrian Blackwood she was abandoning the grief that had become her constant companion. But she could not deny that something had shifted in the cottage's oppressive silence. She found herself anticipating the sound of cartwheels on the lane, found herself composing conversations in her mind during the long evenings, found herself actually opening the books and reading by candlelight instead of simply staring into the fire until sleep claimed her. And when she finally penned a brief note of acknowledgement and thanks, keeping her words carefully formal, she discovered that the walls she had built around her sorrow had developed their first significant crack, and through that crack came not yet hope, but something smaller and more tentative, the possibility that isolation might not be the only path available to her broken heart. The morning came when Catherine's carefully maintained composure finally shattered, quite literally, as she bent to retrieve the watering can from beside the garden gate and felt the world tilt sideways, the sky and earth exchanging places in a dizzying rotation that sent her crumpling onto the frost-hardened ground, her temples striking the stone border with a crack that echoed through the silent morning, and she lay there conscious but unable to move, her vision swimming with dark spots, her body refusing to obey her desperate commands to rise before anyone might see her in such weakness. But fate, it seemed, and had other designs. For Adrian Blackwood happened to be riding past on the lane at that precise moment, drawn by some impulse he would later claim he could not name, and he saw her fall, saw the stillness that followed, and was off his horse and through her gate before rational thought could intervene, his hands gentle but urgent as he lifted her from the cold earth, carrying her into the cottage with a strength that made her feel weightless, despite her protests, which emerged as barely coherent whispers. He laid her on the worn settee near the fireplace, his face carved from concern, and when she tried to sit up, tried to insist she was perfectly well, merely tired, he fixed her with a look that permitted no argument, and dispatched his groom to fetch Dr. Hartley from the village, with instructions that brooked no delay, and Catherine found herself trapped in her own parlour, with the Duke of Rothermere kneeling beside her, pressing a cool cloth to the bruise forming at her temple, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to weep for reasons she could not entirely articulate. Dr. Hartley arrived within the hour, his familiar weathered face creased with worry, and he shooed Adrian from the room with a firmness that surprised Catherine. She had not imagined anyone could command a duke, and conducted his examination with practiced efficiency, asking questions that seemed innocuous at first, but grew increasingly pointed. And when he finally sat back and regarded her with an expression mixing wonder and concern, Catherine felt her heart begin to race with a premonition she could not yet name. "Lady Catherine," he said gently, taking her hand in his age-spotted ones, "when did you last have your monthly courses?" The question struck her like a physical blow, for she realized with dawning horror that she could not remember, that the chaos of the divorce and her subsequent grief had driven such considerations from her mind entirely, and as Dr. Hartley continued his gentle interrogation, the fatigue, the morning nausea, the dizziness pieces began falling into place with the inevitability of a puzzle completing itself, and when he finally spoke the words, "You are with child, my dear, approximately 3 months along, I should estimate," Catherine's world fractured completely, her mind flying back to that single night 6 weeks before the divorce, when Edmund had returned from London unexpectedly and had come to her chambers for the first time in months, driven by wine and some impulse she had not questioned, too grateful for even that hollow intimacy to wonder at its motivation. And now she understood with a clarity that felt like drowning that she carried Edmund's child, that the barrenness for which he had divorced her had been a cruel fiction, that her body had finally, impossibly, achieved what 5 years of desperate hoping had failed to accomplish. But the timing was catastrophic, the circumstances impossible, and as Dr. Hartley patted her hand and murmured reassurances about her health and the child's apparent vigor, Catherine felt not joy but terror, a suffocating recognition that this revelation would destroy whatever fragile peace she had begun to construct in her exile. And when Adrian was permitted to return to the parlour, when his eyes met hers across the small room, she saw that he knew something profound had shifted. Though Dr. Hartley had spoken to him only of exhaustion and the need for rest, and in that moment Catherine understood that the life she had imagined, solitary, hidden, safe in its very obscurity, had become utterly impossible, for the child growing within her would demand choices she was not prepared to make, would force her back into a world she had fled, would require a courage she was not certain she possessed. The days following Dr. Hartley's revelation stretched before Catherine like an endless corridor of impossible choices, each one leading to a different chamber of potential ruin, and she found herself pacing the cottage's small rooms at all hours, her hand pressed unconsciously to her still flat abdomen, her mind churning through scenarios that all seemed to end in disgrace. If she told Edmund, he might claim the child, and she would be bound once more to a man who had publicly declared her worthless, or worse, he might reject the claim entirely. call her a liar, or worse still, suggest the child belonged to another man, for why else would a supposedly barren woman suddenly conceive mere weeks before their separation? If she remained silent, she would bear a child alone, without name or protection, condemning an innocent life to bastardy and shame. And yet the thought of facing Edmund again, of seeing triumph or calculation or cold assessment in those pale eyes, made her physically ill in ways that had nothing to do with her condition. She had not eaten properly in 3 days when Adrian came to call again, arriving in the late afternoon when autumn light slanted gold and melancholy through the cottage windows, and she received him with a composure that felt brittle as spun glass, offering tea with hands that trembled only slightly. But his grey eyes, those penetrating, unsettling eyes, saw through her performance immediately, and she watched him catalogue her pallor, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way she held herself as though afraid she might shatter. "You have not been resting, as Dr. Hartley advised," he said quietly, and it was not a question, and Catherine felt something in her chest constrict at the gentle censure in his tone, at the concern that seemed entirely genuine, and therefore somehow more difficult to bear than pity would have been. She deflected with practiced skill, speaking of household matters and the weather, thanking him again for his continued generosity while maintaining the careful distance propriety demanded, but Adrian did not permit her retreat, and as the afternoon lengthened, he drew her into conversation with a patience that gradually loosened the tight coil of her anxiety, speaking of books they had both read, of philosophical questions that had no easy answers, of the way grief could transform a person into someone they no longer recognized, and Catherine found herself responding with an honesty that surprised her, found the words flowing more freely than they had in months, though she kept the central secret locked away behind walls of careful omission. When he finally rose to depart, the sky outside had deepened to violet, and the first stars had emerged like distant promises, and he paused at the door, his tall frame silhouetted against the gathering dusk, and said with quiet intensity, "Whatever burden you carry, Lady Catherine, you need not carry it entirely alone. I would count it a privilege, not an obligation, to offer whatever assistance might ease your circumstances." And she stood frozen in the center of her small parlor, watching him go, his words echoing in the sudden silence with the weight of an unspoken vow. And for the first time since learning of the child, Catherine felt the suffocating pressure around her chest ease just slightly, felt the possibility that perhaps not every path led to ruin, that perhaps in this unlikely quarter she had found, if not salvation, then at least a temporary harbor. And as November's darkness settled fully over the countryside, she sat by the fire and allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to trust someone again, even as caution whispered that trust had cost her everything once before. The weeks that followed unfolded with the quiet inevitability of seasons turning, November yielding to December's first frosts, and Adrian's visits to the cottage became as regular as the tolling of the village church bells, always in the afternoon when pale sunlight struggled through winter clouds, and Catherine found herself anticipating these interludes with an eagerness that both comforted and alarmed her, for she had not expected to desire anyone's company again, had believed. Her capacity for trust had been cauterized by Edmund's betrayal, yet here was the Duke of Rothermere, arriving with books tucked under his arm, and an expression of such genuine pleasure at seeing her that she could not doubt its sincerity, and gradually, so gradually she barely noticed the transformation, the formal distance between them began to thaw like ice beneath spring sun. They spoke of everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from Locke's theories of natural rights to the best method for propagating roses, from poetry that made the heart ache to the small absurdities of village life. And Catherine discovered that Adrian possessed not only a formidable intellect, but also a dry wit that occasionally surprised laughter from her, that rare and precious sound she had thought lost forever. And she noticed, too, how her condition was beginning to manifest in ways that could not be entirely concealed. The slight rounding of her abdomen beneath her simple gowns, the way she tired more easily and had to sit when previously she would have stood, and Adrian, ever observant, adjusted his visits accordingly, never commenting directly, but ensuring she was comfortably settled before engaging her in discourse, his courtesy so natural it felt like care rather than obligation. It was on a particularly bitter afternoon, with snow threatening in the heavy grey sky, that their conversation turned more personal, the fire crackling in the grate as Adrian spoke haltingly of his past, of an engagement 5 years prior to a woman named Lydia Thornton, of how Edmund Ashford had been his closest friend then, trusted with confidences and business matters alike, and of how that trust had been shattered when Adrian discovered Edmund had seduced Lydia and convinced her to break their engagement, not out of love but out of spite over some imagined slight, some perceived advantage Adrian had gained in society. And as Catherine listened to the quiet pain in his voice, saw the old wound still raw beneath his ducal composure, she understood that his isolation mirrored her own, that they were both refugees from Edmund's casual cruelty, and in that recognition something shifted irrevocably between them. Emboldened by his vulnerability, Catherine found herself speaking of her own humiliation, not the public divorce but the private degradation that had preceded it, the years of being made to feel defective, broken, less than whole, the physicians and their invasive examinations, the herbal remedies and prayers, and Edmund's growing coldness each month. Her courses came, and Adrian listened without interruption, his grey eyes steady on her face, and when she finally fell silent, exhausted by the confession, he said quietly, "You were never the one who was broken. Catherine, may I call you Catherine?" And she nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and he continued, "Edmund is a man who destroys what he cannot possess completely, who mistakes cruelty for strength. You survived him, and that takes a courage he will never comprehend." And in that moment, as snow began to fall at last outside the cottage windows, Catherine felt the weight she had carried for so long ease just slightly, felt the possibility that perhaps she was not ruined after all, merely wounded, and wounds, given time and care, could heal. The news arrived on a grey morning in mid-December, delivered by Mrs. Kemple, who had heard it from the butcher's boy who had it from a London servant, and Catherine stood in her cottage kitchen with the letter trembling in her hands. Not a letter addressed to her, but a clipping from the Times that someone had thought to send anonymously, perhaps out of malice or perhaps misguided kindness, and there in stark black ink was the announcement: Lord Edmund Ashford's engagement to Miss Arabella Worthington, daughter of the shipping magnate Thomas Worthington, a girl of 19 with a dowry rumoured to exceed £30,000, and Catherine felt the words strike her like physical blows, even as her rational mind told her this changed nothing. That Edmund had made his choice months ago when he cast her aside, yet the reality of seeing it formalized, of knowing he had moved forward so decisively while she remained suspended in this limbo of secrets and impossible decisions, brought a surge of emotions so complex she could scarcely name them all. There was relief, certainly, that he had found what he sought and might therefore leave her in peace, but beneath it ran currents of anger at the injustice that he should be celebrated for this new match while she had been reviled for her supposed failure, that society should welcome his fresh start while condemning her for the very barrenness he had falsely attributed to her, and deeper still, in places she was ashamed to acknowledge, there flickered something that might have been grief, not for Edmund himself but for the girl she had been when she married him, for the innocent hopes that had been slowly murdered over 5 years of cold assessment and medical humiliation, and she found herself sitting at the worn kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her abdomen, where the child grew steadily larger. This impossible child that proved Edmund's accusations had been lies, and she realized with sudden crystalline clarity that she could not delay her decision any longer, that the child would not wait for her courage to catch up with her circumstances. Adrian arrived that afternoon as had become his custom, but Catherine heard his approach with something approaching panic, for she was not composed, had not repaired the damage of her morning's weeping, and when she opened the door to him, she saw his expression shift immediately from pleasure to concern, saw those penetrating grey eyes take in her reddened eyes and the trembling of her hands, and he stepped inside without waiting for invitation, closing the door against the bitter wind, and said with quiet intensity, "What has happened?" And Catherine found that she could not dissemble, could not maintain the careful facade she had constructed over weeks of his visits, and the words spilled from her like water from a broken dam. "Edmund is engaged. He has found his heiress and will marry in the spring. And I am carrying his child. Your Grace, I have been carrying it since before the divorce, though I did not know. And now I must decide what to do because this child deserves better than a mother in disgrace and a father who abandoned us both. But every choice leads to ruin, "And I do not know," and her voice broke entirely, and she stood trembling in the center of her small parlor, having spoken the secret that had tormented her for weeks. And Adrian stood utterly still for a long moment, his face unreadable, and Catherine felt terror grip her heart at what she might see there, disgust, perhaps, or calculation, or worse, pity. But when he finally moved, it was to guide her gently to a chair and to kneel beside it so their eyes were level, and he said with a quietness that somehow conveyed absolute certainty, "Then we must ensure the child has everything it deserves: protection, name, honor, and a mother who need never feel shame again." And Catherine stared at him through her tears, not understanding, and Adrian took her hand with great care, as though she were something precious and fragile, and said words that would alter the course of both their lives. "Marry me. Catherine, let me give you and the child my protection, my name. Everything I have to offer you need not face this alone." Catherine spent the night in a state of sleepless turmoil, Adrian's proposal echoing through her mind with the persistence of a church bell that would not cease its tolling, and she rose with the winter dawn to find him already at her door, his carriage waiting in the lane, and she knew without asking that he had come for her answer, that he would not leave this in abeyance any longer, and she invited him inside with hands that trembled slightly as she prepared tea neither of them would drink, the silence between them charged with an intensity that made the small cottage parlor feel impossibly intimate. He waited until she was seated, demonstrating that patience she had come to recognize as fundamental to his character, and then he said quietly, "I understand you have questions. Catherine, ask them, and I will answer with complete honesty," and she found herself studying his face in the pale morning light, searching for signs of deception or hidden motive, and finally she spoke the fear that had kept her awake through the long, dark hours. "Why would you do this? You are a duke. You could have any woman in England, someone without scandal, without another man's child. Why bind yourself to my disgrace?" Adrian was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of consideration, as though he were choosing each word with great care. "There are several answers to that question, some more palatable than others. I could tell you it is for justice, that claiming you and the child as mine would be the ultimate revenge against Edmund, who betrayed us both, and there would be truth in that, for I confess the idea of his humiliation brings me satisfaction," and Catherine felt her heart sink slightly at this admission, but Adrian continued, "I could tell you it is respect, that I have come to know your courage and your mind over these weeks, that I believe you would make a duchess of real substance rather than mere ornament, and that too would be true." And he paused, then added with a vulnerability that transformed his austere features, "But the fullest truth, Catherine, is that I am weary of being alone, that I have been half alive since Lydia's betrayal, and in your company I have felt something I thought lost forever. The possibility of genuine partnership, of building something real with someone who understands that hearts can be broken and still function, still perhaps even love again, though I ask no such thing from you now." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty of his words, at the loneliness she recognized because it mirrored her own, and yet her practical mind, sharpened by years of navigating Edmund's manipulations, could not entirely quiet its skepticism, and she heard herself asking, "And what would you expect from such a marriage? What would be my position, my obligations?" Adrian's response was immediate and clear. "You would be my wife in name and in law, with all the protections and privileges that position entails. The child would be recognized as mine, raised as my heir. If a son, with every advantage I can provide. As for obligations, I would ask only what you are willing to give, Catherine. I will not force intimacy or affection, will not demand what is not freely offered, and if you wish to maintain separate chambers and a cordial distance, I will respect that boundary absolutely." And something in Catherine shifted at these words, at the understanding that he was offering her agency even as he offered protection, that he saw her not as a prize to be claimed, but as a person with the right to choose her own path, even within the confines of their arrangement. And she realized that her internal debate was no longer between accepting and refusing, but between accepting with walls intact or accepting with the possibility of something more. And the question that rose to her lips surprised even herself. And if, in time, those boundaries shifted, if what began as convenience became something else, would that be unwelcome to you? She saw his expression transform, saw hope kindle in his eyes like a flame catching light, and he said with a quietness that somehow conveyed absolute sincerity, "Catherine, nothing would be more welcome, but I will not press you, will not assume or demand, will wait however long it takes for you to feel safe enough to trust again." And in that moment, sitting in her mother's cottage with winter light streaming through the windows and her future hanging in the balance, Catherine made her decision, though she said softly, "I need 3 days to consider fully. To be certain this is right for the child and for us both, can you grant me that time?" And Adrian rose, took her hand with infinite gentleness, and replied, "Take what time you need, I am not going anywhere." Tome. The 3 days Catherine had requested stretched before her like an eternity, and yet passed with frightening swiftness, and she found herself observing Adrian with new eyes during his visits, watching not merely what he said but what he did, how he moved through the world when he thought himself unobserved. And on the second day she watched from her cottage window as he stopped to help Mrs. Kemple with her broken cartwheel, kneeling in the muddy lane without regard for his fine coat, his hands working alongside the blacksmith's apprentice with easy competence, and she saw how he spoke to the boy with respect rather than condescension, how he pressed coins into the widow's hand despite her protests, and something in Catherine's chest loosened at the evidence of genuine kindness rather than performed nobility. That evening a storm rolled in from the north, one of those December tempests that turned the sky bruised dark and sent rain sheeting against the windows with violent insistence, and Adrian had been taking his leave when the first drops began to fall, but within minutes the deluge was such that Catherine could not in conscience send him back to his estate, and she found herself offering him shelter with a mixture of propriety and something deeper, something that whispered this was a test of sorts, a chance to see what lay beneath the careful courtesy they had maintained, and he accepted with visible relief, and they found themselves in the strange intimacy of an unplanned evening, the storm raging outside while the fire burned low in the cottage hearth. They talked through the long hours as the wind howled and the rain drummed its relentless rhythm on the roof, talked in ways they had not permitted themselves before, and Adrian spoke of his childhood, of a father whose expectations had been crushing, and a mother who had died too young, and of the loneliness of inheriting a dukedom at 23 and learning that his title made him simultaneously the most sought-after and most isolated man in any room. And Catherine found herself sharing things she had never spoken aloud. The small humiliations of her marriage to Edmund, the way he had looked through her rather than at her, the doctors who had examined her like livestock and pronounced her deficient, and she saw in Adrian's eyes not pity but recognition, the understanding of one wounded soul acknowledging another, and sometime past midnight as the storm reached its crescendo, Catherine realized that what she felt was not gratitude or even respect, but something far more dangerous, something that felt like the first tentative shoots of genuine affection, and she understood with sudden clarity that she could build a life with this man, that the marriage he offered need not be merely transaction, but could become something real if they were both brave enough to let it. When dawn broke pale and watery over the sodden landscape, Catherine made tea in silence while Adrian stood at the window watching the retreating clouds, and she came to stand beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, and said quietly but with absolute certainty, "I have my answer, Your Grace, if your offer stands. I accept it, but I must tell you my conditions." And he turned to her with such transparent hope that her heart ached, and she continued, "I will not pretend feelings I do not yet have, will not offer false affection out of obligation, but I promise you honesty, partnership, and the possibility that what begins as arrangement might become something true." And Adrian's response was to take her hand with infinite gentleness and say, "That is more than I dared hope for. Catherine, honesty and possibility are foundation enough to build upon," and so it was decided, there in her mother's cottage with the storm-washed morning light streaming through the windows, and that they would marry, and marry quickly, before her condition became impossible to conceal, before either of them could retreat into doubt. And Catherine felt fear and hope warring in her chest in equal measure, but beneath both was something she had not felt in years, the sense that she was choosing her own path, rather than merely enduring the one others had forced upon her. The wedding took place 5 days later in the small village church, a stone building with narrow windows that let in only thin streams of winter light, and Catherine stood in a simple dove-grey gown that concealed her condition, while Adrian wore dark wool rather than the ceremonial splendor his rank might have demanded, and the only witnesses were the vicar, his wife, and 2 servants Adrian had brought from his estate, people whose loyalty he trusted absolutely. And Catherine felt the strangeness of it all as she spoke her vows in a voice that barely trembled, and this quiet ceremony so vastly different from her first marriage, with its crowds and flowers and elaborate breakfast, and she wondered if the simplicity was somehow more honest, more true to what they were actually promising each other, not passion or romance, but partnership and protection. A transaction made sacred by mutual need and tentative hope. Adrian's hand was steady as he placed the ring on her finger, a heavy gold band set with sapphires that had belonged to his grandmother, and when the vicar pronounced them, man and wife Adrian kissed her cheek with such careful gentleness that Catherine felt her throat tighten. And then it was done. She was the Duchess of Rothermere, and they signed the register in the vestry, while sleet began to tick against the windows, like the sound of time itself, marking this transformation, and within the hour she found herself in Adrian's carriage, travelling the short distance to Rothermere Hall, the great estate she had glimpsed only from a distance during her months in the cottage, and as they approached up the long drive, lined with bare oak trees, she felt her anxiety crystallize into something almost like panic, for this was real now, irrevocable, and she was entering a life she had not imagined even a fortnight ago. The hall itself was magnificent in that austere way of ancient noble houses, all grey stone and mullioned windows, ivy climbing the walls despite the winter cold, and Adrian handed her down from the carriage himself and said quietly, "This is your home now, Catherine. I have given instructions that you are to be obeyed in all things, that your word is law here as much as mine." And she heard in his tone both formality and something deeper, a desire to give her the agency she had lacked in her first marriage, and she nodded, not yet trusting her voice, and together they entered the great hall where the staff had assembled to meet their new mistress, and Catherine forced herself to stand straight and acknowledge each introduction with the grace her mother had trained into her from childhood, though she felt like an impostor playing a role for which she had not properly rehearsed. Adrian showed her through the principal rooms himself, the formal drawing rooms and the library and the music room, and finally up the grand staircase to the family wing, where he opened a door to reveal a suite of chambers that took her breath away, all ivory silk and polished mahogany, a fire already burning in the hearth and winter roses arranged on the writing desk, and he said, "These are yours, entirely yours. My chambers are through that connecting door, which will remain locked unless you choose otherwise, and I have had the key placed on your side so that you alone control access." And Catherine turned to look at him, this man who was now her husband, and saw in his face both desire and restraint, the tension of wanting and refusing to take. And she understood that he meant what he had promised, that he would wait for her invitation however long it took, or even if it never came, and she said softly, "Thank you, Adrian, for all of this, for giving me choice when I had none." And he bowed slightly and replied, "I want only your comfort and safety. Catherine, the rest will come or not, as time and fortune allow." And then he withdrew to his own chambers, and Catherine was alone in her magnificent new rooms, and she sank into the chair by the fire and let herself cry, though she could not have said whether the tears were grief or relief, or simply the release of unbearable tension. And outside the windows the sleet turned to snow, and winter settled over Rothermere with the weight of held breath. And Catherine knew that she and Adrian had entered a liminal space, neither truly together nor entirely separate, and that how they emerged from this careful cohabitation would determine whether their marriage remained merely arrangement or transformed into something neither of them yet dared to name. The months that followed their quiet marriage unfurled with the strange quality of a dream half-remembered, and Catherine found herself inhabiting a life that was simultaneously more comfortable and more unsettling than anything she had known. For Adrian was unfailingly courteous in ways that made her chest ache with confused longing, always present yet never imposing, always attentive yet never presuming, and as January gave way to February, and her body swelled with the child she carried, she became acutely aware of every small gesture he made, the way his hand found the small of her back when she navigated the stairs, steadying her without comment, the way his eyes followed her across rooms with an expression she could not quite name, concern mixed with something deeper and more dangerous that neither of them acknowledged in the careful daylight hours of their cohabitation. She discovered his character in fragments, like piecing together a mosaic from scattered tiles, and each new revelation shifted her understanding of the man she had married, and she learned that he visited the village every Thursday to review requests from tenants who needed assistance, that he had quietly paid for the rebuilding of 3 cottages damaged in the autumn storms, that he corresponded with agricultural reformers about improving crop yields so his tenants might prosper rather than merely survive. And once she came upon him in the library reading to the housekeeper's grandson, a boy of 7 who was learning his letters, and Adrian's voice was patient and warm in ways that made Catherine retreat unseen, her heart beating strangely fast with the recognition that this man contained multitudes she had not imagined. Depths of kindness he seemed to hide from the world, as though gentleness were somehow a weakness to be concealed. In the evenings they dined together in the small family dining room rather than the formal stateroom, and their conversations ranged across literature and philosophy and the management of the estate, and Catherine found herself looking forward to these hours with an anticipation that frightened her, for she understood that what she felt was shifting dangerously from gratitude and respect towards something that felt perilously like genuine affection, and she would catch herself watching the firelight play across his features and wondering what it would be like if their arrangement were real in all ways, rather than this careful performance of matrimony without its intimacy, and the thought would send heat to her cheeks and she would look away, reminding herself that he had offered protection, not passion, partnership, not love, and that she must not presume more than had been promised, or burden him with feelings he had not invited and might not want. The child moved within her now with increasing vigor, small flutters that became definite kicks, and once during dinner she gasped at a particularly strong movement, and Adrian was at her side instantly, his hand hovering near her but not touching, asking if she needed the doctor, if she was in pain. And she had taken his hand without thinking and placed it against her belly where the baby kicked again, and she watched his face transform with wonder, his eyes widening and his breath catching, and for a moment the careful distance between them dissolved entirely, and they were simply 2 people marveling at the mystery of life. And then he withdrew his hand and stepped back, and the walls went up again. But Catherine lay awake that night thinking of the expression she had seen, the naked longing and tenderness, and she understood that perhaps she was not alone in this dangerous drift toward feelings that had not been part of their original bargain. But the knowledge only made her more cautious, more afraid, for if they both wanted more but neither dared reach for it, they might spend years in this liminal space, married yet separate, together yet alone. And as February turned to March and her time drew nearer, Catherine found herself caught between hope and fear, wondering if the birth of the child would finally break the careful equilibrium they had maintained, or if it would only build the walls higher. And outside her windows the first crocuses pushed through the frozen ground, small brave harbingers of spring that seemed to whisper that transformation was possible, that winter did not last forever, if only one had courage enough to reach toward the light. The pains began on a grey March afternoon, while Catherine stood in the conservatory examining the early tulips that had just begun to bloom, and at first she mistook the tightening sensation for the ordinary discomforts she had grown accustomed to, but then a second wave came harder and lower, and she gripped the edge of the planting table and understood with sudden crystalline clarity that something was wrong, that this was too early, by nearly a month and too fierce to be the preliminary stirrings the midwife had described, and she managed to reach the bell pull before the third contraction doubled her over, and within moments the household erupted into controlled chaos, servants running for the midwife and the doctor, while Adrian appeared from wherever he had been and took in the situation with one swift glance, and Catherine saw his face drain of color as he moved to her side and said, "I'm here, Catherine. I'm here. You're not alone." And she wanted to tell him to leave, that this was women's business and not appropriate for him to witness. But another pain tore through her, and she found herself clutching his hand with desperate strength while he supported her weight and called for them to prepare her chambers immediately. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare of pain and fear, and the midwife's face grew increasingly grave as the labor progressed wrong, the baby coming too early and positioned badly, and Catherine heard the woman conferring in low, urgent tones with the doctor who had finally arrived, and she understood through the haze of her suffering that she might die here, that women died in childbed all the time, and she had been foolish to think herself exempt from that ancient danger, and the thought of leaving this life just as she had begun to find happiness in it seemed unbearably cruel. But then another contraction would seize her, and there was no room for philosophy, only the animal reality of pain and the desperate need to survive it. Adrian refused to leave despite the scandalized protests of the midwife, and Catherine was beyond caring about propriety, beyond caring about anything except the anchor of his presence, and she saw that his legendary composure had shattered completely, that his hands shook when he wiped her forehead with cool cloths, and his voice broke when he murmured encouragement, and once between contractions she opened her eyes to find him praying. This man, who had told her once that he had lost his faith years ago, and she understood that his terror for her was absolute and undisguised, and something in her chest cracked open at the recognition that she mattered to him, truly mattered in ways that went far beyond duty or arrangement or even friendship. When the baby finally came in the dark hours before dawn, it was with a rush of agony that made Catherine scream, despite her determination to maintain dignity. And then suddenly there was release and the thin wail of an infant, and the midwife was saying, "A son, your grace, you have a son?" And Catherine's vision swam with tears and exhaustion as they placed the tiny squalling creature on her chest. And he was so small, frighteningly small, his skin faintly blue and his cries weak, and the doctor was doing things she couldn't quite follow, while Adrian stood frozen beside the bed, staring at the child with an expression of such naked wonder and fear that Catherine's heart turned over, and she whispered, "Adrian," and he knelt beside the bed and touched the baby's tiny hand with one careful finger, and said in a voice rough with emotion, "He's perfect, Catherine. He's absolutely perfect." And then his eyes met hers, and she saw in them everything he had never said, all the careful walls finally demolished by the extremity of this night, and he said, "I thought I would lose you, I thought," and his voice broke entirely, and he pressed his forehead against her shoulder, and she felt his tears wet against her skin, and she lifted her free hand to his hair and said softly, "I'm here, we're both here." And the baby quieted between them, as though sensing the importance of this moment, and Adrian raised his head and looked at her with such intensity that Catherine's breath caught, and he said, "I have loved you since I first saw you, years ago, at another ball where you danced with Edmund and smiled at something," he said, "and I thought I had never seen anyone so beautiful, so full of grace, and I have loved you through every moment since, through your marriage and your suffering and your exile, and I married you not from duty or revenge, but because I could not bear to see you struggle alone, when I had the power to protect you, and this child is mine now in every way that matters, mine because you are mine, if you will have me. If after everything I can dare to hope," and Catherine was weeping openly now, all the careful restraint of their months together, dissolving in the raw vulnerability of this confession, and she said, "Yes, Adrian, yes, I will have you, I do have you. I have been falling in love with you day by day without daring to name it, and I was so afraid you would never see me as anything but an obligation. But I love you, I love you." And he kissed her then with infinite tenderness, despite the midwife's shocked gasp, kissed her while the baby lay between them and the dawn began to break outside the windows, and Catherine tasted salt and promise and the beginning of something she had thought lost to her forever, the possibility of being loved, not for duty or appearance or the children she might bear, but for herself, for the woman she was beneath all the roles and expectations. And when Adrian finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with tears and joy, and he whispered, "My wife, my love, my Catherine," and she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, truly together, and that the careful arrangement they had maintained had transformed at last into something real and fierce, and worth every moment of pain it had taken to reach this breaking point where honesty could finally flourish. The happiness that had bloomed in the quiet sanctuary of Catherine's chambers lasted precisely 9 days before the world intruded with all its harsh complications, for word had spread through the intricate network of servants and village gossip that the Duchess of Rothermere had been delivered of a son, and the news travelled with the swift inevitability of fire across dry grass until it reached London, and the ears of Lord Edmund Ashford, who had been enjoying the renewed attention that came with his engagement to Miss Arabella Hartfield, a banker's daughter whose fortune would restore his failing estates, and Catherine was in the nursery with the baby when she heard the commotion downstairs, raised voices in the entrance hall that carried up through the ancient house, and she recognized Edmund's tone even before the door burst open, and Adrian appeared with murder in his eyes, saying tightly, "He's here. He's demanding to see you and the child. And Catherine, I need you to tell me what you want me to do, because I am dangerously close to killing him where he stands." She had known this confrontation would come eventually, had played it out in her mind during sleepless nights, but the reality of it still made her hands shake as she carefully placed the baby in his cradle and straightened her shoulders and said with more calm than she felt, "I will see him. But you will be with me, and Adrian, he has no power here. Not anymore." And she watched something fierce and protective blaze in her husband's eyes as he nodded and offered her his arm, and together they descended the stairs to where Edmund waited in the drawing room, pacing like a caged animal, and he turned when they entered, and Catherine saw that he looked older, harder, with lines of dissolution around his mouth and eyes that spoke of too much drink and too little sleep. Edmund's gaze went immediately to her still swollen figure, and his expression twisted with something between triumph and rage, as he said without preamble, "You were with child when I divorced you. You deceived me deliberately, and that child is mine by law and by blood, and I have come to claim what is rightfully my property." And Catherine felt Adrian go rigid beside her, but she stepped forward slightly, finding her voice and her courage in ways she had never managed during their marriage, and she said clearly, "You claimed I was barren before all of society. You humiliated me and cast me out without provision or protection. You wanted nothing to do with me or any potential child, and you have no rights here, Edmund, none at all." She watched his face darken with fury as he turned to Adrian and snarled, "You planned this, didn't you? You married her knowing she carried my heir just to spite me and to steal what should be mine, and by God I will take you to court. I will expose this conspiracy and reclaim my son." But Adrian's voice when he spoke was cold as winter frost and twice as cutting as he said, "You will do nothing of the sort, Edmund, because I have taken the liberty of investigating your affairs quite thoroughly these past months, and I have discovered some fascinating information about your debts you owe, nearly £30,000 to various creditors, some of them quite unsavory, and you have been falsifying your accounts to your betrothed's father, and I have documentation of all of it. And if you attempt any legal action against my wife or my son, I will ensure that every scandal, every unpaid debt, every lie is made public, and your engagement will dissolve, and you will likely face criminal charges for fraud." Catherine watched the color drain from Edmund's face as the full weight of his position became clear, watched him look between her and Adrian, and understand that he had already lost, that whatever power he had once held over her was gone, burned away by the protection of a man who loved her and the legal weight of a dukedom that far outstripped a mere viscountcy. And Edmund's shoulders sagged slightly before his pride reasserted itself, and he spat, "You deserve each other, the barren wife and the bitter duke, but that child is still mine by blood, and you cannot change that." And Catherine surprised herself by laughing, a sound without humor but full of strength, and she said, "Blood means nothing without love, Edmund, and you have never understood that. He is not your son in any way that matters, and you need to leave now and never return." They stood in tableau for a long moment, the weight of history and betrayal thick in the air between them, and then Edmund turned on his heel and strode from the room, and Catherine heard the front door slam with a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter, and she swayed slightly, and Adrian caught her immediately, holding her close while she trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline and relief, and he murmured against her hair, "You were magnificent, Catherine, absolutely magnificent." And she clung to him and thought that perhaps she was finally becoming the woman she had always hoped to be, strong enough to defend what mattered, brave enough to claim her own happiness despite the ghosts that haunted her past. Adrian made his decision that very evening as they sat together in the library with the baby sleeping in Catherine's arms, and he said with quiet determination, "We cannot live in the shadows waiting for Edmund to strike again. We must take the offensive and control the narrative before he attempts to poison society against us." And Catherine felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, even as she recognized the wisdom in his words. And 3 days later, the invitations went out on heavy cream paper, edged in gold, summoning the cream of society to a grand ball at Rothermere House in London, and Catherine watched the preparations unfold with mounting terror, for she had not faced the Tun since her humiliation, had not stood before the collective judgment of those glittering crowds who had witnessed her disgrace, and the thought of doing so now with all the complicated truth of her situation made her want to flee back to the countryside and hide forever. But Adrian was patient and steady as he helped her prepare, hiring a modist who created a gown of deep sapphire silk that made her eyes luminous and her figure regal despite the softness that remained from childbirth, and he gave her a necklace of diamonds that had belonged to his mother with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. And the night of the ball arrived with the inevitability of tide, and Catherine stood at the top of the grand staircase in Rothermere House, looking down at the assembled guests who had come out of curiosity or loyalty, or the simple inability to refuse a ducal invitation, and she saw familiar faces from her past life, women who had once called her friend, and men who had danced with her, and she saw the speculation in their eyes and the whispers behind fans, and Adrian took her hand and squeezed it gently and whispered, "You are the Duchess of Rothermere. You are my wife, and you have nothing to be ashamed of." And together they descended into the glittering chaos of the ballroom, where chandeliers blazed and music swelled, and the air hummed with barely suppressed gossip. Catherine moved through the evening in a state of heightened awareness, making conversation with matrons who regarded her with everything from sympathy to suspicion, dancing with Adrian in a waltz that felt like a public declaration, and she knew that everyone was waiting for something, some revelation or scandal, and she saw Edmund arrive halfway through the evening, his face hard and his betrothed notably absent, and he positioned himself near the refreshments, watching them with barely concealed malice, and Catherine felt the weight of history pressing down on her until Adrian touched her elbow and guided her to the center of the room where the orchestra had paused, and he raised his hand for silence, and the crowd quieted with the swift obedience accorded to power and rank, and Adrian's voice rang clear and authoritative as he said, "My lords and ladies, I have invited you here tonight to share my profound joy and to make an announcement that concerns the future of the Rothermere line." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as Adrian continued, and his hand firm at the small of her back. "The Duchess of Rothermere has blessed me with an heir, a son born healthy and strong, and I claim him publicly and proudly as my own, as the future Duke of Rothermere, and I will stand against any man who questions his legitimacy or his place in this family." And the ballroom erupted in a chaos of gasps and frantic whispers, and Catherine saw Edmund's face contort with rage and humiliation, and she saw others calculating timing and propriety, but she also saw the Dowager Marchioness of Westbrook, a woman whose opinion carried the weight of decades, step forward and say clearly, "I congratulate you both, your graces, and the child is blessed to have such devoted parents," and her endorsement was like a dam breaking, and other voices rose in agreement, and Adrian turned to Catherine and kissed her hand with deliberate ceremony, and she understood that he had just rewritten their narrative in front of everyone who mattered, had claimed her and her son with a finality that transcended biology or scandal, and when she dared to look at Edmund across the room, she saw that he had gone pale and still, and she knew with absolute certainty that his power to hurt her was finally, irrevocably broken, crushed beneath the weight of Adrian's ducal authority and the public declaration that made James untouchable, and she felt something like wings unfurling in her chest, the first true breath of freedom she had taken in longer than she could remember. The morning after the ball dawned cold and bright, and Catherine woke with the peculiar sensation of having crossed an invisible threshold from which there could be no return, and by noon the calling cards had begun to arrive in such numbers that Adrian's butler looked positively overwhelmed as he presented them on a silver salver, and Catherine sat in the drawing-room with her heart in her throat as she sorted through the names, seeing some she had expected and others that surprised her with their presence or their pointed absence, and Adrian appeared at her side with tea and said quietly, "You need not receive anyone you do not wish to see, Catherine. You are the Duchess of Rothermere, and that gives you the privilege of choice." But she shook her head and straightened her spine and said, "No, I must face this. I must show them that I am not ashamed." And so the afternoon unfolded in a series of visits that felt like small trials, each one testing her composure and her resolve in different ways. The Dowager Marchioness of Westbrook came first, her aged face kind and her words carefully chosen as she said, "I have known too many women destroyed by the cruelty of men who blamed them for circumstances beyond their control, and I see in you, a strength that deserves support rather than censure. And her endorsement carried weight that rippled through the subsequent visits, and Lady Pemberton arrived with thinly veiled curiosity and departed with grudging respect after Catherine answered her probing questions with steady dignity. And Mrs. Hartwell, who had once been Catherine's closest friend before the divorce, came with tears in her eyes and apologies on her lips, saying, "I should have written, I should have visited, I was a coward and I am sorry." And Catherine found that forgiveness came more easily than she had imagined, for she understood now the paralyzing fear of social ruin that governed so many lives. But there were also the cuts, deliberate and sharp, the ladies who had accepted the invitation to the ball but who conspicuously failed to call afterward, and Catherine felt each absence like a small wound, even as she told herself they did not matter. And there was Lady Ashford, Edmund's mother, who arrived unannounced and sat rigid in the drawing-room, and said with barely controlled venom, "You have destroyed my son's reputation and stolen his heir, and I will never forgive you for it." And Catherine felt Adrian's presence behind her chair like a shield as she replied with surprising calm, "Your son destroyed himself through his own choices, and the child I bore deserved better than a father who would have viewed him as nothing more than property." And the older woman left in a storm of rustling silk and impotent fury, and Catherine found she felt only pity for a woman so bound by pride that she could not see the truth before her. Through it all, Adrian remained steadfast, appearing at intervals to check on her, bringing refreshments, intercepting particularly difficult guests with his ducal authority, and Catherine realized that his support was not merely performative but genuine, that he truly saw her as his partner and his equal, despite all the complications of their union. And when the last caller had departed and the house fell quiet, she found him in the library with James sleeping in the crook of his arm, and the sight of them together made something warm and precious bloom in her chest, and Adrian looked up and smiled and said, "You were remarkable today. You faced them all with such grace." And Catherine settled beside him and carefully took the baby into her own arms and said, "I could not have done it without you, Adrian. You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever, the ability to hold my head high and claim my own worth." And they sat together in companionable silence while the spring sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. And Catherine thought that perhaps this was what happiness looked like, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but quiet moments of mutual support and growing trust, and she realized that James was thriving, gaining weight and strength with each passing day, and they had decided together to name him James Alexander Blackwood. And when they had him christened the following week in the Rothermere Chapel, the church was full of those who had chosen to support them, and spring had truly arrived, the gardens bursting with daffodils and cherry blossoms, and Catherine saw in the seasonal renewal a symbol of her own transformation. From the barren winter of her first marriage to this tentative, hopeful spring of new beginnings, the months that followed unfolded with a gentle inevitability that Catherine had never known in her first marriage, and by midsummer she had fully assumed the mantle of Duchess of Rothermere, moving through the responsibilities of running the household and managing social obligations with a confidence that surprised even herself. And she discovered that Adrian had been quietly preparing her for this role all along through his patient explanations and steady support, and the transformation of their relationship from careful formality to genuine intimacy happened so gradually that Catherine could not point to a single moment when everything changed, but rather it was an accumulation of small gestures and quiet evenings that built upon each other like layers of silk, until one morning she woke in her chamber and realized that she missed Adrian's presence beside her with an ache that had nothing to do with gratitude or convenience, and everything to do with love. It began with practical necessities, the night when James had colic and would not stop crying, and Catherine had been pacing the nursery for hours when Adrian appeared in his dressing gown and simply took the baby from her arms and said, "Go rest, I will walk with him." And she had been too exhausted to protest, and when she woke hours later, she found Adrian asleep in the chair beside her bed with James peaceful against his shoulder, and the sight had made her throat tight with emotion. And after that, the boundaries between their separate chambers grew increasingly porous, with Adrian appearing to help with late-night feedings or Catherine seeking him out when James did something new and delightful, and there were quiet evenings in the library where she would sit with her needlework while he read aloud from poetry or philosophy, and she found that his voice soothed something restless in her soul. And there was laughter too, genuine and unguarded, like the afternoon when James spit up all over Adrian's impeccably tailored waistcoat, and instead of showing irritation, Adrian had laughed with such pure delight that Catherine had joined him, and they had collapsed together on the settee in a fit of mirth that felt like a small miracle. Catherine watched Adrian transform before her eyes, the stern ducal reserve melting away to reveal a man of unexpected warmth and playfulness, and he was devoted to James with a tenderness that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with genuine love, and she saw him teaching their son nursery rhymes and making silly faces to elicit smiles, and once she found him simply holding the sleeping baby and staring down at him with an expression of such profound wonder that she had to turn away to hide her tears, and she realized that Adrian had been lonely for so very long, that his isolation had been as complete as her own, and they were healing each other through these small daily intimacies, through the building of something neither had expected to find. The night she finally moved permanently into his chamber happened without formal discussion. It was simply that she had fallen asleep beside him after they had been talking late into the evening about their hopes for James's future, and when she woke in the grey dawn light to find his arm around her waist and his breath warm against her hair, she felt not alarm but a profound sense of rightness, and Adrian stirred and opened his eyes and looked at her with a question in their depths, and Catherine answered by moving closer and pressing her palm against his cheek, and he kissed her with a reverence that made her understand that this was not merely desire, but something far more precious. And afterward, as they lay together in the tangle of sheets with the morning sun painting stripes across the floor, Adrian whispered, "I never dared hope that you might come to love me in return." And Catherine realized with a shock that she did love him, deeply and completely, not with the desperate passion of youth, but with something more substantial and enduring. And she said, "I am truly happy, Adrian. Perhaps for the first time in my life I am truly happy." And she meant it with every fiber of her being. And as summer deepened into its golden abundance, Catherine found herself transformed not just in circumstance but in spirit, no longer the broken woman who had fled in shame, but someone new, someone stronger, someone capable of both receiving and giving love without reservation. The news reached them on a grey autumn morning when the leaves had begun their annual surrender to the wind, and Adrian's solicitor arrived with reports that Edmund's engagement to the young heiress had dissolved amid whispers of financial impropriety and questions about his character that had apparently proven too much for the bride's prudent father. And Catherine felt a complex knot of emotions as she heard the details, a mixture of vindication and something that might have been pity for the man who had once been her husband. But before she could fully process this information, another letter arrived 3 days later, this one delivered directly to Catherine and written in Edmund's own hand, and the words were alternately pleading and threatening, claiming that he had been ruined by lies and that she owed him recompense for the damage her remarriage had done to his reputation, and there was a barely veiled suggestion that he might make public certain claims about James's parentage if she did not provide financial assistance. And Catherine's hands trembled as she read it, not from fear precisely, but from anger that Edmund would still attempt to manipulate and control, even from his diminished position. She brought the letter immediately to Adrian, who read it with an expression that grew progressively colder until his face might have been carved from marble, and he said quietly, "He has finally overstepped beyond redemption." And Catherine saw in his eyes a fury that was all the more dangerous for being utterly controlled, and Adrian summoned his solicitor and his man of business and spent the afternoon closeted in his study. And when he emerged as the sun was setting, he found Catherine in the nursery with James and said, "Edmund will call here tomorrow. I have sent word that we will receive him, and this will end once and for all." And Catherine felt her spine straighten with resolve as she nodded and said, "We will face him together, as we have faced everything else." And Adrian's expression softened as he crossed to her and pressed a kiss to her forehead and murmured, "You are the strongest woman I have ever known, and he will not harm you or our son again." Edmund arrived the following afternoon in a hired carriage that spoke volumes about his reduced circumstances, and he was shown into the formal drawing room where Catherine and Adrian waited side by side, presenting a united front that must have been immediately apparent. And Edmund looked older than Catherine remembered, his face marked by dissipation, and his clothes, though expensive, showing signs of wear. And he began with bluster, demanding assistance as though it were his right, speaking of their former marriage as though it gave him permanent claim on her resources, and Catherine felt Adrian's hand find hers beneath the folds of her skirt and draw strength from that silent support, as she said with remarkable calm, "You divorced me publicly and cruelly, Edmund. You severed all ties between us, and you have no claim on me or my child." And Edmund's face flushed with anger as he turned to Adrian and said, "You stole what was mine, both the woman and the heir, and you will pay for that theft." But Adrian simply smiled, a cold and terrible expression, and drew from his pocket a sheaf of documents and said, "I have here evidence of your debts, which total more than £15,000, and documentation of your attempts to defraud investors in a shipping venture that never existed, and witness statements regarding your behavior toward 3 different women of questionable virtue whom you promised marriage while still engaged to Miss Hartford." And with each revelation Edmund grew paler, and Adrian continued with relentless precision, "If you ever contact my wife again, if you ever speak James's name in public, if you make any attempt whatsoever to interfere in our lives, I will ensure that these documents reach not only the magistrate, but every newspaper and scandal sheet in London, and what little remains of your reputation will be utterly destroyed. Do you understand me?" And Edmund understood. Catherine could see it in the collapse of his shoulders and the defeat in his eyes. And he left without another word, climbing into his hired carriage and disappearing down the drive. And within a fortnight, they heard that he had left London entirely, retreating to some distant corner of the country where his name and shame were unknown. And Catherine stood at the window watching the autumn rain and felt not triumph, but a profound sense of freedom, as though the last chain binding her to that painful past had finally been severed. And when Adrian came to stand beside her and asked gently, "Are you well?" she turned to him with tears on her cheeks and said, "I am free, truly free at last." And he gathered her into his arms and held her while she wept, not from sorrow but from relief, and the past was finally, irrevocably laid to rest. A year had passed since James's birth, and autumn had returned to paint the countryside in shades of amber and crimson, but this time the season did not speak to Catherine of endings and sorrow, but rather of abundance and harvest, of the fullness that comes after patient cultivation. And she stood at the window of their country estate, watching Adrian in the gardens below with their son, and James was now walking with the unsteady determination of a child just past his first birthday. And Adrian crouched beside him, pointing at the brilliant leaves and the late-blooming roses, and Catherine's hand rested unconsciously on the gentle swell of her belly, where a new life grew. This child, undeniably Adrian's, conceived in love rather than duty, and the knowledge filled her with a joy so profound it sometimes brought tears to her eyes at unexpected moments. The transformation of their lives felt nothing short of miraculous when she allowed herself to reflect upon it, and she often thought of the broken woman who had fled through rain-soaked streets with a single trunk, and wondered if that Catherine could have imagined this future, this fullness, this sense of belonging so complete that she sometimes had to remind herself it was real and not merely a dream from which she might wake. And Adrian had changed too, the stern reserve that had once defined him, now only visible in his dealings with the outside world. While in the privacy of their home, he was gentle and playful, devoted to James with a father's true love, and attentive to Catherine with a husband's genuine affection. And she had learned the geography of his smiles, the rare full one that transformed his face entirely, and the small private curve of his lips that was reserved only for her. And she treasured both. They had settled permanently at the country estate after Edmund's final defeat, preferring the peace of rural life to the demands of London society, though they maintained the townhouse and made occasional appearances when duty required. And Catherine had discovered that she had a talent for estate management, and Adrian consulted her on decisions about tenants and improvements, treating her opinions with respect that would have shocked those who remembered her as Edmund's diminished wife, and together they had created something neither had possessed before, a true partnership built on mutual regard and deepening love, and the estate itself seemed to respond to their happiness, the gardens flourishing and the household running with smooth efficiency, and the tenants spoke well of them in the village, and Catherine had begun quietly helping women in difficult circumstances, providing employment in the household or assistance in finding situations elsewhere. And Adrian supported these efforts without question, understanding perhaps that she was healing her own wounds by helping others. That evening, after James had been settled in the nursery with his devoted nurse, Catherine and Adrian sat together in the library, where they had spent so many quiet hours in the early days of their marriage, but now there was no careful distance between them, and she sat curled against his side with his arm around her shoulders and her head resting in the hollow where his neck met his shoulder, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the book-lined walls, and Adrian's hand moved gently over her belly, feeling for the flutter of movement that was still too faint for anyone but Catherine to perceive. And she covered his hand with hers and said quietly, "I never thought I could be this happy. I never dared imagine that life could hold such contentment." And Adrian turned to press a kiss to her temple and murmured, "You have given me everything I never knew I needed. A family, a home that is more than just a house, a reason to wake each morning with gratitude rather than duty." And Catherine lifted her face to his and said with the same wonder she had felt a year ago, but now without fear or hesitation, "I love you, Adrian, so completely that sometimes I cannot comprehend how I lived before without knowing what this felt like." And he kissed her then with infinite tenderness, and later as they climbed the stairs to their shared chamber with their fingers intertwined, Catherine thought that autumn had indeed returned, but it brought with it not the chill of loss but the warmth of harvest, not the memory of shame but the promise of continued abundance, and she had been transformed from a woman society had discarded as broken into someone whole and beloved, and the miracle of it would never cease to fill her with quiet amazement.